again, everyone. My name is Brian Balicki, your host of the podcast, The Juice is Worth the Squeeze. Embrace it. It's my life story of 56 plus years as a Type 1 diabetic and still counting. Today's podcast covers one short, recent chapter of that 56-year history. It's titled, Diabetes Can Be Wild, How I Navigated Type 1 During My 10 Days in South Africa, on safari with the Big Five, and experiences in Capetown. Managing Type 1 presents challenges every day, no matter who you are, where you live, what resources you have access to, or how you spend your days. After 56 plus years, I can testify that rarely does a day go by without facing some surprises, risks, and opportunities. How you manage these challenges every day determines largely how successful you may be in managing Type 1 over a lifetime. Or as I have repeated many times in my past and future podcasts, the juice may be worth the squeeze if you embrace it. My personal experience during a 10-day trip to South Africa is one chapter from my lifetime story of this narrative. It confirms several truths I've developed about managing Type 1, but one in particular is uppermost in my mind. What's that, you ask? Trust, very simply. For Type 1s like me, trust means several things. Specifically, trust the professionals who treat and care about you. Try as best as possible to build stable and long-lasting relationships with these health professionals that you have the most confidence in. Here's another pretty obvious one. Trust those family closest to you and have your best interests in mind. It takes a family to help you manage Type 1. You might make some progress going it alone, but over the long haul, having family to support you who share the same general health, eating, and recreational goals makes the task so much more doable. Here's another really important one. Trust the signals your own body's sensors are giving you about how well you are managing yourself. Compare those signals to all the external feedback you hear every day about your diabetic and overall health. Make adjustments, take advantage of the free advice your body is giving you. In the end, Mother Nature may be your most trusted guardian angel. Here's a really important one also. Trust but verify the tools you rely on to measure your core diabetic metrics. I have one entire chapter on this in an upcoming book. I can't tell you how often and how important this is. Finally, trust me. Well, not really, but hear me out here. There's one truth you can take to the bank about how best to manage yourself and be healthy over a lifetime. You don't need to be perfect in managing Type 1. Just be good. These truths may be so basic and obvious that we sometimes forget them, or worse yet, ignore them altogether. That's why I felt it important to restate some of them here. These principles were reconfirmed in my mind during a 10-day trip to South Africa almost a year ago. I can't tell you how many times my thoughts drifted to a question that only a Type 1 diabetic like me might wonder about amidst all the amazing experiences I had during 10 days in the country. That question, how different would my life be now, or would it have been, growing up in South Africa with Type 1? I invite you to listen to this podcast and my upcoming podcast also to dive deeper into these truths and the more detailed 10 rules I'll be talking about that I believe are essential for managing diabetes over nearly 6 decades. Today we pick up where we left off at the end of my prior podcast. In my last podcast, I shared anecdotes about some real anxieties and concerns I thought about as a Type 1 and preparations I made leading up to a holiday family vacation almost 1 year ago to the day of this podcast. There were several personal anecdotes I shared. I don't want to repeat them here, but you can revisit them by listening to my episode 6, part 3 podcast, In and Out of Africa. Today, I plan simply to follow up on some of the promises I made in my last podcast. Our family holiday vacation began in Washington, D.C. in mid-December 2023. we boarded a 16-hour nonstop flight to Capetown, South Africa. Most family members had never taken a nonstop trip of that length before. Eating dinner and breakfast during the flight and sleeping in between was novel for me, to say the least. I wouldn't call this a major challenge, but it was a major departure from my daily schedule as a Type 1. How did I manage? I sandwiched a few hours sleep in between spending some time reading and catching the latest Denzel Washington movie, Equalizer 2, as a matter of fact. There was a cute Kodak-like moment in the morning of that flight, shortly before landing in Cape Town. I was awakened by my 6-year-old granddaughter. She thought it was really cool to stay up very late the night before and wake me up, along with all my other family members, at about 6 o'clock in the morning, wearing the biggest devilish smile she could sheepishly muster. It was like opening the bedroom curtains back home to the brightest morning sunshine you could ever imagine. However, this single moment was more delightful than any morning coffee I had ever enjoyed. The flight turned out to be very silky smooth. The in and out of dozing, if you want to call that sleep, would eventually catch up with me once we arrived at our safari destination, but more on that in a bit. After landing in Cape Town, we had a one-night layover. The next morning, we immediately got back on a short, in quotes, short, 2-hour flight to Port Elizabeth, a small town in extreme southeastern South Africa. When thinking about the distance we covered in that trip alone, I thought it was actually about the same time I spent flying many times between Washington and Chicago, my hometown. 720 miles by air, 13 hours by car. I did it many times. The immensity of Africa itself quickly began to settle in on me during that short trip. After landing in Port Elizabeth, the closest airport to our ultimate safari destination in Makhanda, we began another 2-hour trip. This time, the entire family packed inside a minivan and traversed the African countryside to Makhanda, one of the most remote parts of southeastern South Africa. In my mind, the remoteness of that rural area was best captured by the fact that from Port Elizabeth to Makhanda, I did not see a single universally recognized blue sign with a big white H in the center of it. What did that mean? It meant there was a hospital nearby. Nope, not a single hospital nor any health facility for that matter. I didn't think too much about it at the time or even wanted to make much of it as it was happening. But looking back, it strikes me I would have had no idea where I might have been transported or taken to if I had a medically urgent or emergent need. I simply had not seen any local medical clinics or hospitals. Johannesburg, some 3 hours north by plane, might have been the closest, most appropriate destination for care in an emergency. I later learned the preserve we were staying at did have a landing strip where celebrities and, yes, emergent medical cases could be transported in and out of. When we arrived at the resort, the hosting staff were extremely courteous, affable, and caring. We were instantly made to feel comfortable and relaxed. We were assigned our individual team of local rangers and hosting staff for the villa at the preserve we were staying at. From that point onward, we were always guided and escorted around by safari rangers in Hummer-like all-terrain vehicles in the private game reserve. Remember the opening scene of one of the opening scenes in Jurassic Park, when Sam Neill, Jeff Goldblum, Laura Dern, and others were introduced to, quote, the dinosaur preserve. I actually had some of those same feelings upon arriving at the preserve. Make no mistake, like the actors in Jurassic Park, we could only trust the rangers and the resort staff to guide us during our 5-day encounters with some of the most vicious wild animals on the planet, just like in Jurassic Park. This one part of my experience reminding me so much of what I experienced after first becoming a 16-year-old diabetic 56 years earlier. No, I wasn't scared, but I'd be lying if I didn't admit I mulled over certain anxieties about the myriad scenarios that might or could play out while meeting the big five up close or simply living in the remote bush country of South Africa. In my lifetime, I learned a big part of managing my Type 1 diabetes is being prepared for potential surprises or the unexpected. Basically, this meant imagining what I would do if the unexpected did occur. On this trip, the possible surprises I might face on safari seemed limitless. At a certain point, I guess, I simply stopped thinking about them and started enjoying the experience. I guess this is what is called living in the moment. Shortly after arrival, like the guests at Jurassic Park, the reality finally hit me about what I was going to face in those first 5 days. Not since my earliest days as a Type 1 would I be placing my trust and well-being with a group of professionals I'd never met before. Yes, each day I would be putting my trust in a new network of everyday people, a combination of professionally trained and experienced safari rangers, safari managers, and housekeeping staff for the villa that we were staying at. Their backgrounds were impressive: veterinary medicine, environmental science, natural resource management, a healthy dose of common sense, and human hospitality, South African style. Essentially, this was a multidisciplinary, multi-specialty group of professionals who made their living by ensuring the survival of wild animals and hosting humans who wanted to experience what life is like, coexisting with the Big Five in their own neighborhoods. The animals depended on them, and as did my family, we depended on the professionals in South Africa. For 5 days, I felt this was not going to be all that different from the team of professionals that helped me through my earliest days of transitioning to Type 1 diabetes 56 years ago. My biggest anxiety? This might surprise you, but what happened in 1968 was an accident, a tragic one at that I never gave any thought to, much less expected. But this time, yes, this time, I actually chose this option for a family vacation and would live with its outcomes, whatever they might be. So while on safari, we followed the directions from our safari rangers and staff about how to behave and conduct ourselves when out in the African bush. This included not only how to dress for the South African summer weather, but equally important, we were informed it might make sense to avoid wearing clothing that stood out in the natural surroundings of the wild animals. Staff said to us that we should just try to blend in and do everything possible not to draw too much attention. When it came time to eat breakfast and dinners, all of which were more than generous, by the way, we did not initially know what we might be eating at each sit-down meal. For me, the real question wasn't really what we were going to be eating as much as how diabetic-friendly each meal, snack, drink, or whatever might be to me. That meant how carb-heavy each of the meals was likely to be. I calibrated my CGM and blood glucose meter almost daily to make sure they were synced up perfectly or as much as possible during our safari time. We quickly learned how much what we consumed each day at meal times was hunted down, grown, and harvested on the game preserve itself. This included the wildfowl, the vegetables, and more. We simply again trusted and were not disappointed one bit. Quick comment about the professionalism of the preserve itself. The staff and our rangers went beyond their call to help us feel at home and welcome. What we didn't learn till later in our stay was that in addition to being our gracious hosts and guides for 12 to 16 hours each day, they had other non-hosting duties, such as working the game preserve itself, doing handyman jobs to maintain the houses and thousands of acres that guests traversed at the preserve, as well as maintaining their own houses where they lived as workers. As best as we could tell, there were no, quote, 8-hour days or usual days. This was tourist season, where they were routinely called on to do what it took to meet each day's chores and emergencies. Now for some of the promised details about the most dramatic parts of my trip. This is a beginning. In the South African bush country, we were going to mingle among wild animals. Make no mistake about it. In the game preserve, we were told the animals were never fed anything in the preserve. They relied solely on their natural predatory instincts, habits, and prey in their immediate surroundings to survive. To be clear, they killed, hunted, and scavenged among themselves and their natural habitats to remain alive each day. I don't think I need to clarify what this scenario meant for our own personal safety while on safari. Wherever we traveled, to remote parts of the Makhanda Game Preserve, to see the Big Five, elephants, lions, leopards, rhinos, buffalo, and an assortment of less intimidating creatures, we trusted the rangers to bring the wildlife to us, to safely see and even mingle with the animals up close. Yes, both we and they mingle very close to one another. Repeatedly during our daily journeys, we were within a stone's throw away from the big five, as well as some less intimidating creatures. Yes, giraffes, baboons, antelope. Oh, and lest I forget, the devil-eared African fox. I can't forget that little creature. The devil-eared African fox was actually kind of cute. I recall the very first day of safari like it was yesterday. It was a bit embarrassing, to be honest. Remember my earlier comment about the intermittent sleep during our 16-hour plane flight and how it finally caught up to me? Well, during our orientation, we were told each morning we would begin our safari day with a 5 a.m. wake-up call, followed by a small, quick breakfast before beginning our morning safari adventure. What happened on day one? Well, like clockwork, the wake-up call came at 5 a.m. sharp. I picked up the phone, listened for a few seconds to a quiet male voice, and hung up. A second call came. I picked up once again, listened for a few seconds longer, and again I hung up. Boy, did I make an impression on our ranger for that day, Matt, who was assigned to us to make the wake-up call. He finally gave up and proceeded, along with the rest of my family, to that day's safari trip without my wife and I. We caught up with Matt and the group later in the afternoons for the afternoon safari trip. I scrambled to explain why we didn't respond to his very gentlemanly morning greeting. Instead of stating the obvious, we were just plain worn out by our constant traveling the day before, I tried to pass it off as possibly being a crank phone call. In hindsight, that was kind of a lame excuse. A crank call out in the middle of the African bush country at 5 a.m.? Oh well, it brought a few chuckles later that day among my family. So here's a couple of the greatest hits from our early meetings with rhinos and cats, the biggest and fastest cats. First, our meeting with the rhinos, white and black rhinos to be clear. None of my family were familiar with white and black rhinos. I would not have recognized either, nor would they have, had it not been for the rangers telling us one simple fact. There was no difference in color at all between the rhinos. I learned that the real difference between the two had nothing to do with it. White rhinos are more common, the most common, while black rhinos are much more rare. So how could anyone tell the difference between the two? It was the shape of their mouths. This feature is linked to their eating and grazing habits. So our first encounter with the white rhinos went something like this. They appeared. Their mouths were very square, even rectangular, or box-like actually. Both groups donned horns, big ones too, and they could hurt you badly if they were roused and charged you. Luckily, I guess, being the holiday season, chuckling a little bit here, I guess the white rhinos were feeling more friendly to their visitors from the north that day, so we never really experienced exactly what it felt like to create some urge or some anger on their part. While we stared at them, they simply went about their business and relaxed. Nothing we did seemed to stir or arouse them. So later, we had our first encounter with black rhinos. One afternoon, we dropped in on a mother black rhino and her baby calf. Despite their gender and age, these rhinos appeared a bit more aggressive than the white rhinos we had visited earlier. Maybe it was just the maternal protective instinct of the mother kicking in that moment, but the calf also appeared a bit hostile towards us. These animals were truly imposing, just as much as the white rhinos were the previous day, but in fact, they were a bit more alarmed and surprised than the white rhinos were. They were more guarded, as any mother might be with her infant, but within a few minutes after our arrival, they relaxed, seemed friendly, and didn't seem to mind our presence too much. As tourists, we could clearly see the facial differences between them and their white counterparts. The mouths of these rhinos were more rounded and less chiseled than the white rhinos. The black rhinos appeared to be far more eager and comfortable with posing for our cameras, oddly enough. Very photogenic, in fact. Just trying to be a bit humorous here, but actually, we were initially a bit tense when the mother and calf jumped from behind their bush and looked at us squarely before our cameras. We didn't want to make too much of this quick reaction. After all, they were less than 20 to 30 yards from us, literally less than the distance between home plate and first base on a baseball field back home. So you can see why we were guarded in our reaction. That combined with those really sharp horns, we tried to be on our best behavior, as you can tell. Not very much time would have elapsed if the two rhinos didn't like our presence and suddenly chose to charge us in our green all-terrain vehicle that day. Soon after we started gazing at the mom and her calf, interestingly, they came a little bit closer, as if to mark their territory. We noticed the mother appeared to have a runny nose that day. The snout was noticeably dripping with something a bit more unsettling. For us humans, usually the reverse is true when the child is the one who happens to have the runny nose. Not this day. True, it looked unladylike, but what did we know? We had never met a black female rhino with child before. Did we catch the mother taking care of some domestic or maternal chores? For all we know, she might have been doing what many mothers find themselves doing when neighbors just happen to drop in, stressing to get her child ready and off to some afternoon activity before dinner. In that moment, I thought how us humans might look and react when a neighbor shows up unannounced. Little did we know how similar our daily routines might actually be. Just a thought, but as it turned out, that was our one and only encounter with black rhinos during safari. Short, sweet, and drama-free. So let's go on to the cats, the cheetahs and leopards to be exact, the most speedy land animals known to mankind. How close were we to these animals? We were no less than, again, 30 to 40 yards, or 90 to 120 feet from them in several instances, during the daytime and nighttime hours. In a single moment of rage or sport, we were so close, we figured these animals could cover this distance within about 1 to 2 seconds. Luckily, our first flirtation with cheetahs happened to be during daytime hours, and it was a very relaxed one at that. At least they were. They were not in any enraged or emotional mood. It was a very innocent encounter, and actually it was our first time out in the bush during safari. It was midday, and we kind of snuck up on them very carefully. We couldn't tell if they were resting following a very active night before, hunting down their prey, or were they resting for an active evening that they expected that night, preparing to hunt down that night's dinner. We were obviously hoping the former was the case. With few exceptions on safari, we began to see a pattern that day that oddly would repeat itself over the 5-day safari. We soon realized our encounters with the Big Five, luckily I might add, tended to happen when they were either relaxing, resting, or simply not really caring that strangers from out of town were busy clicking away or videoing them in their most passive state. For sure they were passive, but I believe only so long as us humans did not do anything to disrupt their rest or annoy them. With one video clip that I took, I included it here to capture how close this one pair of cheetahs were to each of the all-terrain vehicles that my family and I were traveling in. Another thrilling encounter with cats occurred while tracking a single leopard during the early evening and darkness of the Makhanda countryside. Yes, we tracked a single leopard beginning with a late afternoon sighting. He was first sighted slowly strolling toward us, crossing a bridge that we would later use multiple times, going to and from our base camp resort to the bush country, in daylight and darkness of night. When the leopard disappeared from our sight that afternoon, wanting us to get a closer view, our rangers and all-terrain vehicles continued to follow the leopard in the countryside. Daylight gradually slipped away to early evening, and finally darkness set in. I can't speak for others, but for myself, I was beginning to wonder how much longer the rangers would continue to track the leopard. It was exciting for sure, but I don't think any of us didn't for 1 second have the same thought I was. Were the rangers pushing the envelope a bit? Were we trusting that they had done this many times before and would not put our excursion in harm's way? But we were probably thinking, at least I was, how many times had they done this? And how late did they continue their tracking to, in the darkness of night, to rendezvous with that leopard? Suddenly, our day-long excursion led to the dramatic encounter we had hoped for, just as darkness settled in. We found the leopard in a slow prowl, stopping, even casting a quick look back at us, and then continuing with his methodical, deliberate prowl looking for some eats for that evening. We were warned not to use the bright lights of our cameras and iPhones to track the leopard, as we could not tell if or how quickly he might react to this if the bright lights alarmed him. All of us thought this animal could travel, again, 35 miles an hour in daylight or night. Here we were no more than 30 to 40 yards away from one of the quickest, deadliest animals on the planet. We journeyed the bush countryside for the better part of an afternoon that day, tracking this one leopard for a closer look. We watched him earlier, walking toward us across a bridge, disappearing as he climbed up the side of a small canyon wall, stalking on a hillside above us, and then looking down on us. In the end, we viewed this leopard for relatively short time, or at least it seemed so. So now on to the biggest cats, our encounters with the lions. First, we viewed them hunting and stalking a small breed of African eland one afternoon. The eland are a type of antelope in the African bush. We watched them from a distance in our own first encounters as they hunted for their prey. After an unsuccessful afternoon of hunting, we got close enough to them to become, essentially, the hunted. Luckily, this never happened, but what followed was some of the most dramatic, truly up-close viewing of animals in the wild I had ever witnessed, and probably will ever again in my life. By comparison with our other contacts with the Big Five, this rendezvous with the lions was probably the second most dramatic. For me, at least, it was second only because we were so very close. You'll see in a minute, but in spite of this, we never once felt threatened. No, we didn't. In fact, I had never seen a lion before. If I had never seen a lion before, it would have been hard to convince me that they were as deadly as they are commonly portrayed to be. But here again, we trusted our rangers to arrange our meeting with the cats. What was it like? I felt we were kind of like neighbors who dropped in on their house after a big family meal. Yes, it felt as if we were literally hanging out in their living room. They did not appear to be hungry, actually more like a bit lazy, much like how you or I might feel after a big Thanksgiving dinner or any big dinner. Yes, we drove up, parked, entered their personal surroundings, watched for a while, and they fell asleep. Neither they or we felt the least bit threatened. I suspect after 10 to 15 minutes, they might have felt a bit imposed on by us, the neighbors. So what happened? They got up, moved on. We did it also, as it was a cloudy and cool day and daylight was beginning to wane. We found the lions to be very tolerant, accommodating, relaxed, and quite the host for that short time that afternoon. What an experience to be so close, to have such a laid-back rendezvous, to observe some very private moments with some of the most ferocious animals on the planet. This is nothing like I would have ever imagined could be possible, and looking back, I still find it hard to believe that it actually happened. It's also now hard to believe how trusting we were of the rangers who guided us in those Kodak moments that day in Makhanda. But we were, and by the way, how lucky we were to have taken that opportunity to experience something we may never again. We were extremely lucky to have the experience, knowledge, and preparedness of the ranger teams working with and for us that day. They were sort of like my own healthcare team. They knew the risks, they respected the animals themselves, and they knew how much they could push the limits of the animals themselves that allowed us to spend time in their very private spaces. I think you can see why I used the term mingle earlier in my podcast to describe what our interactions were like with the Big Five during our time on safari. Big cats allowed us to hang out while they went about their daily routines, all of the time being within a stone's throw away. We watched them groom themselves, and they allowed us to view them literally pass out and fall asleep. Can you remember a time ever when your neighbors, friends, or even family dropped in and you did any of the above in their presence? Looking back to those moments, it's still amazing to realize how much the big cats trusted us, how we trusted them, and how both of us trusted our professional ranger teams and hosts to help us live some very dramatic and laid-back moments in our lives. You can say all you want about how cell phones interfere with our daily lives. I have a feeling, however, Steve Jobs was smiling down upon all of us in those moments when he saw how his little handheld invention enabled us to capture and share forever many truly Kodak moments. So I'm going to stop here and ask you to join me in my next podcast, the final part of my time on safari, when I share experiences mingling with the biggest of the big five, the elephants. If you can believe it, there were more lengthy, dramatic, exciting, and yes, much more tense moments in certain instances than our encounters with the big cats. I'll also share how my experiences impacted me as I navigated my Type 1. Remember how I spoke earlier about how I would accept the outcomes, whatever they might be, of the 10-day gambit to South Africa? Well, here's a teaser. They were equally amazing, given all the events that surrounded me during 10 days in the country. It ends with a very personal story about interactions my wife and I had with some local South African vendors on Christmas Eve last year. For the time being, I'll wish you a happy holiday season. Be safe, be happy, and for all the top Type 1s out there, remember, you don't need to be perfect, just be good as you manage yourself during the holidays. Above all else, don't stress. Thanks for your time and attention. If you have any comments or questions about today's podcast, I'd love to hear your feedback. Visit my podcast survey at fanlist.com/the juice. I repeat, fanlist.com/the juice. Signing off for now, cheerfully, Brian Belicki. Best wishes in navigating your own Type 1 journey. Keep believing and trusting. Happy holidays.